Welcome to Stories Pulse, where every tale comes to life with emotion and meaning. Before we dive into today's incredible story, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so don't forget to comment below. Let's get started. The late afternoon sun struggled to pierce through the gathering storm clouds as Thomas Wilson stood in his vast Kansas fields. His weathered hands tested the soil's moisture. At 73, he'd seen enough seasons to read nature's signs like a well-worn book. The sophisticated irrigation system that stretched across his 1,000 acres gleamed under the darkening sky, a testament to how far he'd come from his humble beginnings. A cool breeze rustled through the wheat, carrying the promise of rain. Thomas inhaled deeply, savoring the earthy scent that always preceded a storm. His arthritic fingers dug into the soil, feeling its consistency with the expertise of decades. "Maybe we're getting that rain after all," he muttered to himself, brushing dirt from his calloused fingers. Then, the first low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, breaking the silence and sending a shiver down his spine. Something about the storm felt different this time. The air was thick, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. As the wind picked up, it wasn't just the crops that seemed to sway. The entire landscape seemed to shift under the weight of an unseen presence. A crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the horizon for a brief, blinding moment. Thomas squinted into the distance, his heart pounding in his chest. What was it? He wasn't sure, but something was coming. The rumble of thunder confirmed his prediction, a sound that still filled him with the same wonder it had in his childhood. Straightening his back with a slight grunt, Thomas surveyed his empire. The wheat fields stretched toward the horizon, golden waves dancing in the pre-storm breeze. His farm manager, Ted, approached in a pickup truck, dust billowing behind him. "Mr. Wilson, Weather Service says we've got a big on coming in," Ted called out through the truck window, his face etched with concern. "They're talking heavy rain, possible hail." Thomas nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "About time. The soil's been thirsty." He paused, then added, "Make sure the new irrigation sensors are secured. We don't need another mishap like last spring. And get the equipment under cover. No sense taking chances with hail on it." "Yes, sir. Though with your equipment, we could probably water half the county if we needed to," Ted replied, his tone a mix of awe and practicality. "Johnson's farm next door is looking mighty dry." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The sophisticated irrigation system had cost millions, but it had paid for itself many times over during the drought years. He remembered when he'd first proposed installing it. People thought he was crazy to invest so much. Sometimes the best investments look like madness to others. "Ted," he said, patting the younger man's truck door, "keep an eye on the western section. That new wheat variety we're testing needs special attention." As Ted drove off, Thomas began his slow walk back to the house, stopping occasionally to pull stubborn weeds from the pathway. The storm was near. He could feel it in the air, thick with anticipation. Every instinct told him this would be no ordinary storm, but what it held, he couldn't yet say. The first heavy drops began to fall, dotting his worn denim shirt with dark spots. He didn't hurry. Rain had been his companion for too many years to fear it now. The modern farmhouse loomed ahead, its white walls a stark contrast to the darkening sky. It was nothing like the humble shack he'd started in, but Thomas had kept that old building standing on the edge of his property. Some memories were worth preserving, even the difficult ones. As the rain intensified, the sound of it pounding against the earth grew louder, almost deafening. But to Thomas, it was comforting, familiar. Yet beneath the soothing rhythm, something else lingered, a sense of urgency, of tension, building in the storm. Something was shifting in the air, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was more than just a storm. The memories came unbidden, as they often did during these solitary moments. Thomas could still see himself as little Tommy, barely 3 years old, standing beside his father at his mother's funeral. The spring air had been thick with the scent of lies. He'd never been able to stomach that flower since. "Don't look at the coffin, son," his father had whispered, gripping his tiny hand. But Tommy couldn't tear his eyes away from the polished wood that contained his mother, his young mind struggling to understand why she was sleeping in a box while everyone else cried. The mourners wore black, their faces blurred in his memory. except for Mrs. Henderson from next door, who kept dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, muttering, "Poor little thing, not even old enough to understand." But Tommy did understand, more than they knew. He understood that his mother would never again sing him to sleep, or kiss his scraped knees, or tell him stories about the farm animals. A year that felt like an eternity passed. Tommy learned to make his own breakfast, climbing onto kitchen chairs to reach the cereal box. He learned to tie his shoes because there was no one to do it for him. His father tried, but grief had hollowed him out, leaving just a shell that went through the motions of living. Then Rachel entered their lives. She seemed perfect at first. Beautiful, poised, and charming in her blue summer dress and pearl earrings. His father had been smitten from their first meeting at the county fair. "Tommy, this is Rachel. She's going to be your new mother," his father had announced one autumn evening, beaming with newfound happiness. Rachel bent down, her perfume overwhelming, and pinched Tommy's cheek just a little too hard. "We're going to be such good friends, aren't we, Tommy?" she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. But as soon as his father's truck disappeared down the driveway each morning, Rachel's mask would slip. The transformation was terrifying to young Tommy. How her sweet smile would twist into a sneer, how her gentle voice would become sharp as broken glass. "You worthless little brat," she'd spit, shoving a mop into his small hands. "Clean this floor until I can see my reflection in it. And don't you dare cry, or I'll give you something to really cry about." Tommy learned to be quiet, to make himself almost invisible. He became an expert at reading Rachel's moods, anticipating her demands. But everything changed again with Kevin's arrival. While Tommy wore hand-me-downs and did endless chores, Kevin received new toys, new clothes, and endless affection. Tommy would watch from the kitchen window as his father taught Kevin to ride a bike, the same bike Tommy had begged to learn on months earlier. "But Dad," he'd said one day, trying to keep the hurt from his voice, "you promised to teach me too." His father had looked at him distractedly, already turning back to Kevin. "Later, Tommy." Later never came. It became the refrain of Tommy's childhood. Later, not now, maybe next time. Rachel made sure there was always another chore, another task that needed immediate attention whenever Tommy might have had a moment with his father. "Your brother needs new shoes for school," Rachel would announce at dinner. "Tommy, those old ones of yours still fit, don't they?" They didn't, but Tommy had learned to nod and smile. He'd stuff newspaper in the toes and ignore the blisters. It was easier than seeing the way his father would avoid his eyes, knowing they couldn't afford shoes for both boys. The local kids quickly picked up on the family dynamic. Tommy became the other Wilson boy, while Kevin was the star, the favorite, the one who got invited to parties and picked first for teams. But Tommy found solace in the land itself. While Kevin played baseball, Tommy learned about soil composition from Old Man Jenkins next door. While Kevin got new video games, Tommy studied weather patterns and crop rotation. "You've got farming in your blood, boy," Jenkins would say, showing Tommy how to test soil pH with simple vinegar. "Don't you forget that, no matter what anyone tells you." Those words would echo in Tommy's mind for years, becoming a lifeline when everything else was taken away. But for now, he was just a boy, watching his brother receive a new bicycle for Christmas, while he got second-hand work boots, trying to convince himself that somehow, someday, things would be different. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor couldn't mask the approaching finality that hung in the air. Thomas sat beside his father's bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The brain tumor had ravaged him quickly, too quickly for anyone to properly prepare. The once strong farmer had withered to a shadow, his skin pale against the stark white hospital sheets. "Tommy?" His father's voice was barely a whisper. "That you, son?" "I'm here, Dad." Thomas reached for his father's hand, noting how the once strong fingers had become like tissue paper. "You should rest." "Need to tell you." His father struggled with the words. But before he could continue, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of concern. "Darling, the doctor says you shouldn't strain yourself," she said, rushing to the opposite side of the bed. She shot Thomas a warning look. Thomas had seen her earlier, slipping into the room with papers while his father was unconscious. Through the window of the door, he'd watched her guide his father's limp hand across documents he couldn't read, murmuring softly, There. It's all taken care of now." The local lawyer, Mr. Patterson, arrived 2 days after the funeral, his briefcase filled with papers that would change everything. The reading of the will took place in the family living room, where Kevin sprawled in their father's favorite armchair, while Thomas stood by the window. "To my son, Kevin," Patterson continued, adjusting his glasses, "I leave the following: all farm equipment, including tractors and harvesting machinery, the main farmhouse and surrounding property, all currently productive agricultural land, and all business accounts associated with Wilson Farms." Kevin's smirk grew with each item listed. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "To my son Thomas," Patterson continued, adjusting his glasses again, "I leave the northern plot, approximately 30 acres. Thomas knew that plot well, overgrown, untended for decades, more suited to wildlife than farming." Rachel's satisfied smile told him everything he needed to know about how the will had really been written. "It's what your father wanted," Rachel had said afterward, her thin smile not reaching her eyes. "He always said Kevin had a better head for business. But karma, as they say, works in mysterious ways." Just 3 months after his father's death, Rachel took her usual evening walk along the ravine. The spring rains had made the path treacherous, but she'd always been stubborn about her routines. They found her the next morning, her neck broken from the fall. The sheriff stood awkwardly in Thomas's kitchen, hat in hand. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. But Thomas couldn't tell if he meant it. The whole town knew what kind of stepmother Rachel had been. The funeral was small, nothing like his father's. Kevin stood across the grave, already showing signs of his newfound wealth in his expensive suit and gold watch. As they lowered the casket, Thomas thought he saw a flash of guilt cross his half-brother's face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The rain was falling in heavy sheets as Kevin stood on the doorstep, his once pristine suit now ragged and worn, his eyes heavy with regret. The man who had once laughed at Thomas, the one who had inherited the wealth and the life Thomas had dreamed of, was now a shadow of that person. "Thomas, Kevin started, but his voice cracked. He looked over his shoulder as though checking to make sure no one was watching, then back at his half-brother, his face a mixture of shame and exhaustion. "I need your help." Thomas stood in the doorway, his heart pounding. After all these years, after all the wounds that had been left unhealed, he couldn't find it within himself to say no. Not now when Kevin was at his lowest. "What happened?" Thomas asked, his voice softer than he'd expected. It wasn't anger or vengeance in his heart anymore. There was only a quiet, painful understanding of the man before him. A man who had always taken the easy path, who had inherited wealth and power while Thomas had fought for everything he had. Now that same power had crumbled to dust. Kevin swallowed hard, eyes darting as though he were afraid of the answer himself. "I lost everything," he whispered. "The business went under. The investments fell apart. Rachel," he stopped, a shudder racking his frame. Thomas felt the briefest flicker of sympathy for the man who had once tormented him, but it was fleeting, like a shadow passing through a storm. "Rachel?" Thomas asked, his heart tightening. He didn't know what to expect, but the familiar sting of resentment rose in his chest. Kevin's mistakes had cost him his father, his farm, and in a sense, his childhood. "What about Rachel?" "She's gone," Kevin said, his voice cracking again. "The same way she always was. She left me for a richer man. I thought—" He trailed off, clearly unable to find the words to explain the depth of his failure. "I thought I could fix things, but now I'm just empty." For a moment, Thomas didn't know what to say. The man who had once stolen everything from him, who had been the favored son, was now standing before him, broken and alone. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was no satisfaction in the thought. The world had a way of evening things out, but it had come at too great a cost. Thomas stepped aside, motioning for Kevin to enter. "Come in," he said simply. "I'll get you something to eat. You can explain everything over dinner." Kevin hesitated for a moment, then slowly stepped inside, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. As he passed Thomas, his eyes flickered with an unspoken question, perhaps searching for any trace of the bitter boy he'd left behind. But Thomas had long since learned to let go of the past. Together they sat at the small kitchen table, the rain still pouring outside as they shared a meal. And for the first time in years, Thomas realized that the future wasn't defined by what had been taken from him. It wasn't defined by the cruelty of Rachel, by the abandonment of his father, or by the bitterness he had carried for so long. The future, it seemed, could still be shaped by the love and care he'd put into his land, into his daughter, and now, perhaps, for the first time, into the possibility of reconciliation with the brother who had once been his enemy. As they ate in silence, Thomas knew that it wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. But as he looked at Kevin's weary face, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something new, something that might finally heal the wounds of the past. The rain had stopped, but the air in the room still felt heavy with the weight of years gone by, of broken promises and fractured relationships. Kevin's anger had flared up quickly, but there was no denying the underlying desperation in his voice. He wanted to believe there was still hope, but he couldn't bring himself to accept the hand Thomas had extended. As Thomas watched his half-brother stumble out into the night, he felt a mix of pity and resolve. He knew the path Kevin was choosing, self-destruction, driven by pride and addiction, was one he couldn't stop. It was a choice Kevin had made long ago when he'd taken the easy route, when he'd laughed at Thomas's hard work and dismissed it as foolishness. Now, standing in the doorway, watching his brother fade into the darkness, Thomas realized something he hadn't fully understood before. Kevin had never been the one who had truly lost. It was Thomas who had been given a life that was shaped by struggle, by sweat, and by the will to overcome. It was Thomas who had built something from nothing, who had transformed barren land into a thriving farm. Kevin's life, despite the wealth and privilege, had always been a hollow existence, built on superficial foundations. No amount of money, no amount of fancy suits, or cheap whiskey could change that. Turning back into the house, Thomas felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. There would be no more lingering resentments, no more wondering what might have been. Kevin had chosen his own path, and it was one that would lead him to nowhere. But Thomas, well, he had something that couldn't be taken away. The wind outside began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and rain, the kind of earthy smell that had come to symbolize his life. Thomas returned to the kitchen, and as he gazed out the window at the moonlit fields, he felt a quiet, steady peace settle over him. It was the peace of knowing that no matter what, he had built something real. His farm wasn't just land. It was a testament to everything that had been lost and everything that had been gained. It was his legacy, not one of wealth or quick success, but one forged in sweat, perseverance, and love. And Lily, his daughter, she would inherit this farm, this life, and the values that had been instilled in him. The lessons he had learned through years of hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. Kevin's bitterness no longer mattered. His brother's refusal to change, to grasp the opportunity Thomas had offered, was no longer a weight he had to carry. It was Kevin's burden now, and Thomas, well, he had his hands full with the future. The future he would build for his daughter, the future that was waiting for them both out there, in the fields that had once seemed impossible. Thomas took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. There was so much left to do, so much to be proud of. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt his heart lighten. Maybe Kevin was lost, but there was still hope for him, just not here and not in Thomas's world. With a final glance out the window at the moonlit fields, Thomas turned and began to prepare for tomorrow, for the work that would never end. A moment, Thomas stood still, letting the rain soak into his skin, feeling its coolness seep through his clothes. The storm was not unlike the storms he had weathered in his own life. Unpredictable, sometimes fierce, but ultimately necessary for growth. It was a reminder that life, much like the land, needed seasons of change, periods of hardship, and times of renewal. As he watched Michael approach, Thomas felt a deep sense of pride. Not only had Michael proven himself as a worthy partner for Lily, but he had also embodied everything Thomas valued: hard work, humility, and the determination to build something lasting from nothing. Michael hadn't inherited wealth. He had earned every step of his journey, and that, more than anything, was what mattered to Thomas. Lily, too, had grown into a woman who understood the value of the land and the work it required. She carried with her the spirit of both Thomas and Sarah, a blend of determination and compassion. She had chosen a partner who was her equal in both work and heart, someone who wasn't looking for a handout but rather a chance to create something real, something lasting. It was exactly the future Thomas had hoped for her. As the rain fell harder, Thomas could see the silhouettes of his family coming toward him, the three of them a vision of the future. Michael's arm was around Lily's shoulders, and in her arms, their first grandchild slept soundly. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. This, he realized, was what it was all for. The sweat, the struggles, the choices he had made had all been to reach this moment, to see his daughter so happy, to know that the farm would continue to thrive, and to feel Sarah's presence in the very air he breathed. He looked out over the fields, the same fields he had once thought would never yield, now thriving under the care of his daughter and her husband. Everything had come full circle. The land had passed through many hands, but it was now in the hands of those who understood its true value. Everything has a way of sorting itself out, he murmured to himself, watching Lily and Michael make their way toward him, the baby nestled in her arms. As they neared, Lily looked up, her face radiant despite the rain. She smiled at him, and in that smile, Thomas saw the reflection of Sarah, the strength of her mother, and the bright future she had built with Michael. "I see you're still out here in the rain, Dad," Lily teased, her voice full of warmth. "I've been in worse storms," Thomas replied with a chuckle, wiping the rain from his face. "But I wouldn't miss this for the world." Michael smiled and extended his hand to Thomas, his grip firm and confident. "We're ready to take it from here, Thomas. We won't let you down." Thomas shook his hand, meeting Michael's gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of peace. His work was done, and the future was in good hands. As they stood together, Thomas watched the rain fall on the fields, a symbol of renewal and hope. The farm would live on, and so would the legacy of those who had worked it. And perhaps, most importantly, the land had given him something more, something that no wealth or inheritance could ever provide. The satisfaction of knowing that his daughter and her family would carry on the work with love, honor, and a deep respect for the land. "Some things never change," Thomas said softly as he looked around at his family. "And some things change just as they should."